couple of questions if you have any thoughts or.
Is there any compromise to knocking down houses and make sure that, supposing someone bought them for 10,000, a ridiculous amount, would that be better than knocking them down completely? It's a shame to see houses knocked.
It depends on how they're used.
Yeah.
If somebody buys them for 10 grand and puts people on the rental accommodation scheme into them, it might be doing more harm than good, because it might be locking people into a completely unsustainable lifestyle.
Well, why couldn't you then work together to develop the area, bring small shops, to actually make that grow, and then make them work, agriculturally speaking, produce food to be sold to the city, you know? So there is a way to actually not knock things down and then make it improve. Because there are communities just like they're doing, I mean, I can't name them, but you know what they're doing with solar energy in small villages, exactly.
Jordan.
Yeah. So they're in the middle of nowhere and they're growing.
Yeah.
So,
but the great thing about Loch Jordan is it's right beside an existing village. So there's existing schools, churches, stuff going on. Okay, it's new build housing, but it's linked into something else.
And it's on a route.
And it's on a route right beside the rail line and the motorway. It has those connections. Look, some of these can work and be self-sufficient. But I identified three issues: design, the workmanship, the design, and the planning. So if they're badly designed, if they're just really crappy units, if they're in the middle of nowhere, and if they're badly built, I think again about whether to hold on to them.
well, it's just my point. I do think that there is a way where you can actually make this improve and grow as well. It's just depending on how much you think and then make it an infrastructure. But slowly you can grow, into a positive way. So you can turn into recovery centers for alcoholics, and you can make so many things to actually use the land. And then from there, well, they can work the land to detox. That's one possibility.
It could be. It could be. It requires really brilliant people to make that happen.
But it meet these locations.
But even though there are other things that you can, that even being far away, there are things that you can place there, and then slowly make it grow.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of giving you the starting point for.
I think in some instances that will work, but there are many others where it won't.
I wouldn't know for sure how they are, but that's just mentioned. I am sure it's the way.
Sure.
You mentioned a couple of times there the legislation for increasing the standards for apartments. I'm just wondering, is that really the right way to go? Because first of all, you're showing lack of any confidence in planning authorities to decide that case by case. And just a case that actually thwarted a respond development in Blackpool, where a design statement went in and had to be sent back because of that, and I think it's 16 apartments can't be built because it's just clear line in the sand rather than.
Can you remember what the particular issue was? Was it the amount of space inside or outside, or?
I can't remember exactly what it is, but I think it was in the region of a couple of million lost because, we had this, one standard was changed. And fierce amount of effort gone into proposing to renovate the Darling site, and because you've drawn a line in the sand and there's no leeway, that proposal then is completely thrown out the window.
Yeah.
Whereas with a better way of doing it, not be put confidence in planning authorities to decide case by case the standards for apartments.
Don't think so, because I think they just allow crap.
Yep.
And I think we did allow crap for so long, to the point where so many of our small towns are devastated by really shitty buildings. And I mean the kind of the three-story, excuse my French, the kind of two-story apartment over single-story ground floor, no design whatsoever. The fellow who built bungalows suddenly thought he could build apartments. He covered the open area with car parks. He didn't think about waste. So you have this scorched earth approach to the urban environment, where the only people living there would be people living in desperation. We then gave permission for the pub to get bigger and bigger, to become a super pub. So nobody wants to live in the middle of town because you get 500 yahoos out on the street at 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning. We're really killing off our towns by an absence of planning rather than good planning. And 10 times out of 10, I mean, the few people who come to me and said planning is a problem were developers during the final bit of the boom, saying the planning is really holding me up. Bernard McNamara said it to me. Look what happened to him. Others said it. And I think you need high standards. I really do. Because if we don't have high standards, we'll be back 5 or 10 years later knocking it down. And I've seen that. I'm old enough, I'm 48. I'm old enough to have seen Fatima mansions in Dublin done up badly and then knocked down and rebuilt. In the course of 20 years, we put 5 million, which was real money back in the early 90s. We put 5 million into Fatima, did it up and watched it deteriorate again. Then we ended up knocking the whole damn thing down and rebuilding it. And it's half decent now. It needs a lot of management, but we finally made a half decent stab at it. But there was certainly a few of just patch it up and it'll be fine. And
even though both standards are good enough.
That would be
It's not by Dutch or Scandinavian standards. Like
absolutely.
You build for permanent living in an apartment.
I was looking at one of the modules I teach in is building technology, and there was people were talking about this kind of IKEA kit home. IKEA did this deal with the Scandinavian home builder to provide cheap and cheerful starter homes. I went to look at them online. They have that much insulation in the walls. The rooms are 2.55 metres tall. Go into any apartment in Cork or Dublin. I can do that and I can touch the ceiling. It's just 2.4 metres, never an inch more. And we just go for this lowest common denominator standard. It's got to the point where you can't even put in a decent floor because that lowers the floor to ceiling by an inch. And when the builder has built it 2.438 millimetres, which is 8 feet in metric, they built it so tight to that margin that you can't even change the carpet without voiding the certificate of compliance. So I just think we need to take a deep breath and build decent buildings. And maybe we need to build less of them, but I think building quality stuff that will stand the test of time is and countries that have been successful have done that. You know, the average bog standard apartment building in New York, in Brooklyn, where I lived 25 years ago, it still had the same sink, the same bath, the same shower unit, because they built it well in 1890 or 1910. I challenge you to go into any apartment on Bachelor's Walk in Dublin or somewhere in Cork and find the same bath or shower unit from 10 years ago. You can't, because they just put crap in and it fell apart after 2 years. So I'm a believer in really high standards, and I don't apologise for that. So, yeah.
I'm kind of coming from more rural viewpoint and kind of the Irish village. And I was just wondering, say within planning, the zoning of land, within the village, that can really affect the price. Should there be a mechanism brought in to regulise the price between boom and bust periods, so basically people aren't just holding out for the highest price at the top of the market? Because that's really something growing village.
In a sense there has been. The 80% tax on betterment means that if you upzone land from now on, from 2 years ago on, you have to pay 80% tax on that. So that helps to control the price of land in villages. But there is a need as well for, I think, the local authority to think innovatively about how villages can expand and to prepare sketch plans for how you might build medium density development of single sites around the village, how the village could extend. I was on the train, I bumped into the former county architect in Cork, who I think did great work of thinking about how villages could expand. Then there's also an issue of somebody who simply holds on to a site and never sells it, and it's the best site in the village and it's been empty for 50 years. I think certainly we should look at how we could acquire sites that are simply should be built on are sitting there. But I mean, I think a huge part of the solution to that kind of scattergun approach of single dwellings over the entire country is to provide really good places to live in our villages and small towns, and we simply haven't given that choice up until very recently.
But isn't it connected to the mentality that people actually want to have a detached house? They want a piece of land.
They do, but they do because they haven't been given the choice. They've been given 3 really simple choices over the last 30 years. The first choice is a semi-detached house. Decent, good, in the suburbs, works very well for a lot of kids. You can start off, you can die there, it works well. The second choice is an apartment. Most of the apartments we built were not a particularly good standard, and you could hear whatever your neighbours were up to beside you, up above, you could hear the traffic on the street. The third choice is the one-off house. And very often people say, look, I don't want to buy a semi-detached house. I don't want an apartment. And the only other choice was the single-family dwelling. So, and the other thing was the economies were amazing, that the farmer could sell you the site for 50,000. Your brother-in-law had a JCB, could dig the foundations. His cousin was able to build the block walls. And you could build a decent enough dwelling unit for a fairly affordable price. But the problem was that an awful lot of the externalities weren't being paid for. In other words, you weren't paying the price of what will happen when you're 70, 80, 90 years old and you're living without facilities beside you. You weren't paying for the real cost of electricity, transmission lines, or those other issues. I know it's a hugely contentious issue at the moment, but I do think one of the challenges of rural housing is that it's always been very easy to kind of say, look, I don't want to interact with the other stuff, I'll just build a house by myself. I don't know. I mean, rural areas have enormous challenges, but we have gone from a mainly agrarian, mainly agricultural economy to the kind of work that's out there now. Okay, we've seen a fantastic rise in agricultural prices in the last few years, which is helping, but there simply isn't sufficient jobs to keep every rural area fielding more and more GAA teams. It's not going to happen. It's not an easy thing to do, because we are making that transition from agriculture to an urbanized economy. There's choices that can be made within that, but I think the real danger is when people live in the middle of the countryside and then are driving 30, 40 miles in and out of work every day. And that, the advent of the car has really reshaped rural Ireland. You try and push a buggy down a country road and you kind of have to leap into the ditch because there's a 4-wheel drive, late for work, on the phone, probably shaving at the same time. The roads have become exceptionally dangerous. So we don't go for a walk on the road anymore. And then you get huge car dominance, huge rise in obesity, even an awful lot of other factors that are compounded by the way in which we're living in rural areas today. So it's not easy.
I used to think that wanting a detached house, it's a cultural thing. It's not that you're providing for them. So if you raise a hand and ask, what's your dream home? Would you like to have a detached house? And then who would like to do that? And then raise a hand and you can count that it's built within. They say, I want to have a nice house with a nice garden. It's not that you're not providing that.
Yeah, no. I mean, that is the dream. There's a cartoon that kind of shows that. We all want to have that kind of lovely big house in the countryside with lots of land around it. But the reality is you spend a lot more time in the car. The reality is you can't really use the roads as we would have years ago. It's become a lot more difficult.
No, I heard that.
And I worry if we're to take issues like climate change seriously, we're going to have to dramatically reduce the amount of carbon, and I don't see any technical fix to do that. I think we need to be travelling less. I think we need to be living more within our own neighbourhood. So I think the kind of the rural-based commuting is facing challenges. Yeah.
Do you think the core strategy provision introduced as part of the Planning and Development Amendments Act and the 80% windfall tax is enough to kind of to change the future of planning, really, when I suppose there's no legislative requirement for local authorities to have regard to guidelines, or whether to have regard to guidelines?
But they do within the 2000 Act. They have to be in compliance with the regional planning guidelines and the National Spatial Strategy. But the National Spatial
Strategy, spin-off guidelines like building standards or urban zoning.
A lot of those standards are there, and maybe they need to be reinforced within the local development plan. My real worry, though, is that even with the core strategy, even with the changes that we introduced in government, you still have a huge amount of land that's still available for development that's in the wrong locations. So you still have, I saw mapping produced a few days ago showing that the areas outside of our main cities and towns are still expanding very dramatically, and that's a cause for concern. Just decent design. I mean, what was his name? McKay, the guy who did the Bord na Móna villages in the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, built these stunning, fantastic housing areas, often right beside the town, really well designed, linked into the existing setting, good kind of places, public greens and parks and toddlers' greens, all the stuff that Richard Rogers was talking about. There are great examples from the past of how to do it well. Even a lot of the suburbs, the kind of terraced housing suburbs, I know in Dublin, the kind of the Cabras and the Crumlins, they actually work quite well. You know, the ma can send out the kids onto the green and say, come in for your dinner at 6 o'clock. And they're quite child friendly and they work quite well. But they did have a certain density of these terraced housing units of 4 or 6 units that were built a bit more closely together than we were building in semi-detached housing.
Yeah, just on the design quality, I was just wondering, like, I think there's a kind of perception, particularly when you talk about like the economies, say building one house, or say you know this person, they'll be each other foundations for your house, and then you get this kind of configuration of you could say these cat-out houses that really like design quality was awful, and like context was just ignored completely. Is it right that let's say anyone can put in a planning application? Like, is it? I suppose I'm an architecture student, so I'm coming from probably what I think. Like, should an architect not be involved in every planning application? Perhaps fees should go down, but I think it should become less of an elitist thing and more like.
Yeah. Well, architects are kind of cutting their fees to zero almost to get the work. I don't think we can insist that you have to have an architect. In many countries you do, but I don't think you can insist on it. But I would think that these changes in the building regulations are almost forcing you into have a much higher standard of built construction. It's a kind of a move away from the feet and inches into millimetres. If you want to comply with Part L, the energy part of the building regs, we ramped them up by 40%, and in fairness to the new government, it ramped it up by 60%, which essentially means if you build or apply for planning after the 1st of December last year, you have to build an A3 house. To build an A3 house, energy-wise, you can't just lash blocks in together and bung in 2 inches of insulation. It's got to be really well built. You may have to use passive mechanical heat recovery. The technologies are really ramping up quite a bit, and I think it'll be increasingly difficult to get the brother-in-law to do the blocks for you, because I don't think the brother-in-law will be able to give you the standard of detail and construction that is required to meet the building regs. And that's set to improve again. The European Building Performance Directive has set, I think, 2018 for practically zero energy housing. So it's going to get more difficult for the amateur to design or build in the future, and I think that'll be quite a challenge and will require a new wave of craftsmanship, apprenticeship and so on that's quite different from kind of blockwork, plastering and bricklaying. It'll be new trades of insulation, of electronics and other areas.
Who's going to enforce that? Who's going to ensure that any building that's built has met those standards?
Something other than the current system, which isn't working. And I think the lesson from Priory Hall and Balmain and elsewhere is that we need some form of third-party inspection throughout the construction process and post-occupation. So I don't think in today's economy we can kind of set up a new unit in every local authority employing dozens of people, but in the same way as we moved from the state doing our tax returns for us to self-assessment, but with audits on, enough audits to make you be compliant, we need something similar in construction. I don't quite know what the best mechanism, but in the UK, in the United States, you do have systems of inspections that can be arbitrary, and I really worry about the standards. I mean, just from, I teach some master students and they have stories about reinforcing in a trench when the engineer comes out and the engineer leaves, and they take out that reinforcing and put in a thinner grade. Stories about using fairy liquid to keep concrete working. All of these quite scary stories.
Because by having this part that this chap was working here, having a profession involved at very early stages, you don't reach a point later on where somebody encounters an issue like that apartment block in Dublin. And obviously there was issues between being a developer and a builder, and that was one issues. But if you impose professionalism at the beginning of the process, then it resolves so many other issues down the line. And it just seems bizarre that that isn't, with all the regulations coming in so quick on top of each other, but that isn't part of the process.
Yeah. I do remember, I bumped into Michael Smith, who was involved in the setting up of the Madam Tribunal and edits the Village magazine, and he said, why didn't you put in decent design quality into the preamble to the Planning Act? You've got proper planning, you've got sustainable development, but you should have put decent design quality or similar phrasing into the preamble to the Act, just to raise the bar really a little bit in this issue. So that would be one regret I have as regards what we didn't do in the 2010 Act. Not easy. Great.
Okay, so I think we'll leave it there.